Not everyone who talks to you deserves access to your emotions. And the moment you realize that, your entire life changes. Because smart people don't defeat toxic people with arguments. They defeat them with distance, silence, and control. Have you ever noticed something strange? The more you explain yourself to toxic people, the less they understand you. The more you defend your peace, the more they try to invade it. And that's where most people get stuck. They think the solution is better communication. But smart people learn something different. It's not about communicating better. It's about participating less. Smart people don't react emotionally to toxic behavior because they understand that reaction is exactly what toxic people are looking for. When someone is toxic, their behavior is often designed to trigger emotional responses: anger, frustration, guilt, confusion, or the need to defend yourself. If you respond immediately with emotion, you step into their system. You start playing the game on their terms without even realizing it. Instead, smart people pause internally. That pause is not weakness or silence out of fear. It is awareness. It is the ability to notice what is happening without being pulled into it. They observe tone, intention, patterns, and timing rather than just words. Because they know toxic behavior is rarely about the present moment. It is often repetitive, strategic, or emotionally manipulative in structure. When you react emotionally, you lose clarity. You start responding to feelings instead of facts. You might say things you don't mean, over-explain yourself, or try to prove your innocence to someone who is not interested in understanding you. Smart people recognize that this is where control is lost, not to the other person, but to the emotional state they create in you. So instead of reacting, they create space between stimulus and response. In that space, they decide whether something deserves attention at all. Many times, it doesn't. Not every comment needs correction. Not every accusation needs defense. Not every insult needs a reply. This filtering process is what protects their mental energy. They also understand something deeper. Emotional reactions often escalate toxic behavior. When a toxic person sees they can trigger you, they gain more engagement, more control, and more motivation to continue. But when they don't get that reaction, the pattern loses power. The interaction becomes uninteresting to them over time. This doesn't mean smart people feel nothing. It means they don't let what they feel immediately dictate what they do. They process internally first, then choose deliberately whether to respond or not. That small delay creates power, clarity, and emotional independence. Smart people don't argue with manipulation because they recognize that manipulation is not a search for truth. It is a control tactic. When someone is being manipulative, the goal is not to understand your perspective or reach mutual clarity. The goal is to shift your emotions, confuse your thinking, and pull you into a position where you start defending yourself instead of observing the situation clearly. Once you enter an argument with manipulation, you are already inside the framework the other person designed. Instead of engaging, smart people step back mentally and identify what is actually happening beneath the words. They listen for patterns like guilt tripping, shifting blame, twisting facts, or selective memory. Once they recognize those patterns, they stop treating the conversation as something that needs resolution through logic. Because manipulation is not logic-based in the first place. When you argue with a manipulative person, you unknowingly give them more material to work with. Every explanation can be reframed. Every detail can be distorted. Every emotional reaction can be used as evidence against you. So the more you argue, the deeper you get pulled into confusion. Smart people understand that no matter how clear they are, clarity does not matter in a manipulated exchange because the rules keep changing. So instead of arguing, they disengage from the content and focus on the structure of the interaction. They start asking internally whether this conversation is actually meant to solve something or simply control something. If it is control-based, they reduce participation. Sometimes that means short responses. Sometimes it means silence. Sometimes it means physically or digitally stepping away from the interaction altogether. They also refuse to validate false premises. Manipulation often begins with a distorted assumption presented as fact. Smart people don't accept that starting point because once you accept a false premise, every argument that follows becomes irrelevant. Instead, they stay grounded in what they know is true and avoid being pulled into defending things that were never accurate to begin with. Most importantly, they understand that arguing with manipulation gives emotional access to the other person. And once emotional access is granted, control becomes easier to maintain on the manipulator's side. By refusing to argue, smart people protect their clarity, their energy, and their ability to see situations as they actually are rather than as someone is trying to make them appear. Smart people understand that boundaries are not meant to be long discussions or repeated negotiations. A boundary is not a request for approval. It is a statement of how you will allow yourself to be treated, and the power of that statement comes from consistency, not explanation. The moment you start over-explaining a boundary, you unintentionally open it up for debate, and anything that becomes a debate stops being a boundary and turns into a negotiation. When someone repeatedly crosses a line, most people feel the need to justify why that line exists. They try to explain their feelings in detail, hoping the other person will finally get it. But smart people recognize something important. People who respect you don't need endless explanations, and people who don't respect you will not be convinced by them anyway. So instead of explaining repeatedly, they make the boundary clear once, calmly, and without emotional intensity. After that, they focus on enforcement rather than persuasion. Enforcement means adjusting behavior, not repeating words. If a boundary is crossed again, they don't restart the conversation from the beginning. They act according to what they already stated. That might mean stepping away, reducing contact, ending the conversation, or changing the level of access the other person has to them. The response is consistent, not reactive. This consistency is what gives the boundary weight. Without it, boundaries become signals that can be tested. When someone realizes that crossing the line leads to repeated discussions instead of consequences, the boundary loses meaning. Smart people avoid this pattern by making sure their actions align with their words every single time. They also understand that discomfort is part of enforcing boundaries. People who benefited from loose limits will often react negatively when structure is introduced. They may question your intentions, push back emotionally, or try to make you feel guilty. But smart people don't treat this reaction as a reason to weaken the boundary. Instead, they see it as confirmation that the boundary was necessary in the first place. Over time, this approach creates clarity in relationships. People either adapt to the standard or distance themselves from it. There is no ongoing negotiation, no emotional exhaustion from repeated explanations, and no confusion about what is acceptable. The boundary becomes part of behavior, not a topic of debate, and that is what protects long-term peace and self-respect. Smart people use silence as a deliberate tool, not as avoidance or emotional shutdown. Silence, in this context, is not about ignoring problems or running away from conflict. It is about refusing to feed situations that thrive on reaction. They understand that not every statement deserves a reply and not every provocation deserves engagement. In fact, some interactions only gain momentum when you respond, and without your response, they lose direction and power. When faced with toxic behavior, many people feel pressured to respond immediately, to defend themselves, or to clarify misunderstandings. But smart people recognize that silence often communicates more than words ever could. It creates distance between the stimulus and the reaction. That distance is where control is regained. Instead of being pulled into emotional escalation, they remain still, observing what unfolds without contributing fuel to it. This kind of silence is not passive. It is active restraint. It requires awareness because the natural instinct is to fill discomfort with explanation or defense. But smart people resist that instinct. They understand that silence disrupts the expected pattern. If someone is used to provoking reactions, silence becomes confusing for them. It removes the feedback loop they rely on to continue the behavior. Silence also protects internal clarity. When you respond to every emotional trigger, your mind becomes scattered, reactive, and exhausted. But when you choose silence strategically, you preserve mental space. You are no longer processing what to say next in the middle of emotional pressure. Instead, you are observing from a distance, which allows better judgment later if a response is even necessary. There is also a psychological shift that happens when silence is used